we just pretty much start
Winging
going.
it. Okay.
Although I will try to stick to the things they want us to, somewhat of a Jewish folk,
Okay.
and things of that nature, so
Okay.
that if we start drifting too far away from that, and I know you've done many non-Jewish things, but I will just try to
Okay.
bring it back a little bit, that's
Okay.
all. Otherwise, that's my rule, and I know you've done a lot of stuff that is not particular.
That's true.
We don't want to diminish that, but,
Okay.
ready?
Sure.
All righty. It is Tuesday, October 12th, 2004. My name is Nancy Weiss McQuide, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Mrs. Joyce Altman for our oral history project. Welcome, Joyce, and thank you so much for taking time to share your story with us. Let us start with where you were born.
Well, I was born in Milwaukee, but my family lived at the time in West Bend, and I grew up in West Bend for the first 5 years of my life, and then moved to Milwaukee when I was 5.
West Bend.
Yes, or I guess we were the only Jewish family in West Bend.
I can imagine.
Probably today would still be the only Jewish family in West Bend.
How far we've covered.
Yeah.
But you were only 5 when you came
Yes.
to Milwaukee. All right. And where in Milwaukee did you move to?
48th and Hour, and lived there all my life. Little red brick house.
So that's to the west.
Yeah, it's Hour is a block north of Burleigh.
Oh, okay. All right. And were your parents born in the United States, or?
Yes, my father was born in Quincy, Massachusetts, and my mother was born, I believe, in Milwaukee.
Wow. So, and were their parents born overseas, or?
Yes, my father's parents, I believe, were born in Lithuania, and my mother's in Germany.
Okay.
My father's family moved to London first, and then came to Massachusetts, and eventually settled in Milwaukee.
How did they meet, your parents?
My father, this is good now, my father's sister married my mother's brother, and my parents met at their wedding.
Beautiful.
So I have double cousins,
Very fun.
double first cousins.
All right. So when you were 5, you came to 48th and Hour.
Right. Went to Sherman School, and then to Steuben, and then to Washington.
So in the neighborhood.
Absolutely.
Just
Walked
like-
uphill the whole way, a mile and a half to school, uphill both ways. Is that what they say?
Did you have siblings? Do you have siblings?
Yes, I have had two older sisters. My oldest sister is now deceased,
I'm sorry.
Joan Heifetz, and she was 10 years older than I. And then my other sister, Bonnie, is Bonnie Schwid, married to Jim Schwid, and she lives in Mequon, very close to us, and
Wonderful.
we're very close and best friends as well as sisters.
Wonderful, and I know you have 2 lovely grown children and
Yeah.
a brand new grandson. So
That's right. Oh, you
congratulations.
heard the story.
What are your memories of going to grade school and high school in really what was the Jewish enclave, the west side of Milwaukee at that time? Good memories, or?
All good memories. Grade school was always fun. I slept under the table with Billy Oxman. That was my claim to fame. Took naps together.
You heard it here, folks.
Right. Had lots of good friends that are still friends today. Went to Steuben and was struggling with maturing like everyone else did, but had great time, especially involved in musical activities. And same thing with Washington. I think I graduated 6th in the class and
Oh, my.
really enjoyed
What year?
1959. That was a long time ago.
Not so long. Not so long. During those years of junior high and high school, was there a Jewish component to your life?
Oh yes, I was part of BBG. I think it was Menorah chapter. We used to meet at Bethel, and I remember Bethel being built.
Wow.
And being scared because I ran around in all the closets and in the dark. It was scary, but I remember that. That's where we met.
Were you bat mitzvah?
I went to Garfinkel's Hebrew school, and he didn't really have bat mitzvahs. He had graduations. But I did speak Yiddish at my graduation, and I was able to write and read Yiddish script, which I don't think I could do anymore.
And you learned that from listening to...
From going to Garfinkel's.
Oh my gosh.
And then he had me, because I was a musician, I learned the Torah trope, and so I was teaching the Torah and half Torah trope to the guys at the time, and everybody thought that was very strange that Garfinkel would let a girl come in and teach the guys trope.
What was the name? Garfinkel's school? I'm sorry, what was the name of this establishment?
Garfinkel's Hebrew School. It was on 40-something at Center Street, I think. And
I see.
he used to have this blue Hudson, little tiny Hudson blue car, and the girls would come on Friday nights. There must have been 15 of us, and he'd jam us all into the car and drive us all home after lighting Shabbat candles.
Wow. Wow. So you attended Hebrew school for a graduation more than a bat mitzvah.
Right. So I never had a bat mitzvah.
But your family came to this graduation? This was typical of the time that girls would have this graduation?
Oh,
rather than
sure, right.
Girls were not bat mitzvahed so much back then, is it?
No, that's right. So I have a picture of that somewhere with all of us.
So certainly that was a big event.
Yeah, and I'm still friends with some of those people, too.
Wow. And then in high school, in Washington High School, was there still a Jewish component then?
Well, that was the BBG was
BBG,
more there, and yeah, most of our friends were Jewish. They were always, a lot of them were in music, and can't really remember what else we did that was Jewish related, but it was pretty comfortable.
Did you experience any anti-Semitism during those times?
You know, I really didn't. I suppose there was, but I was too naive, and it must have just gone over my head.
Maybe there wasn't. Let's hope for the best.
I mean, I think there's only been 1 or 2 instances in my life where I really experienced it.
So you had mostly Jewish friends, but some non-Jewish friends as well in high school?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
Okay. And music, I know.
I dated one once, and nobody knows. You had to keep that a secret. No.
We won't.
No. Never told my parents.
Let it be.
Okay.
And I know music was always a huge component, part of your life.
Right.
Choir, band, orchestra.
Yes.
You were a pianist. And
yes, I used to, I started taking piano lessons at age 5.
Wow.
A big black piano that I wasn't able to reach the floor, so I used to kick it.
Whose idea was this? Mom and Dad's idea?
Well, everybody in my family except my father played music. So my older sister was a saxophonist, and my other sister was a clarinetist, so they needed an accompanist, so piano was mine. Although I did take up the clarinet later on in choral conducting.
So did a teacher come to your home, or did you go?
Teacher came from the Wisconsin Conservatory of Music, came to my home from 5 till...
Foreshadowing.
From the time I was 5 till I was 14, and then I changed to another teacher from the conservatory and studied till well after I was married and had children.
You enjoyed it?
I guess I must have. To me, it always came fairly easy, and so I never really thought of it as a career. It was just something I did because it was fun to do.
So did you go to college then, or?
I went to the University of Wisconsin, and I was a math major for 2 years, and in 6 weeks' time into my junior year, I decided to switch to music, so I trounced over to the music school and did an audition and joined and became a music major, and then went on to get a master's in music.
How did your parents feel about that?
My mother was hoping I would become a doctor, a physician, but she was very happy. She says, if you're going to get anything, at least get a teaching certificate or a teaching degree so that you have something to fall back on. And that was good advice.
You did that?
I did that.
Okay. And your father felt pretty much the same, I'm sure?
Kind of went along with that, yeah.
Sure. So you graduated from UW-Madison.
Got a master's degree.
During your years at Madison, was there an element of Jewish observance in your life?
I did not join a sorority because I was so busy with the music. There wasn't a lot of Jewish involvement, except that one day I got a call from Rabbi Swarzynski, who was a name that's very well known in both Milwaukee and Madison. And he asked me to come and see him, and I thought something had happened. I thought something was wrong, and I went in to see him, and he said, I want you to teach in my... He said, oh, I understand you're a pianist. I said, yes. He said, I want you to play the organ for our Sunday school.
Wow.
And I said, Rabbi, I don't play the organ. He says, so you don't use the feet pedals. And so I thought, well, it was good money at the time, and I was a struggling student. So I said, okay, I guess I could do that, but I need a ride. And he said, I'll get you a ride. I said, oh, I'll get you a ride. And then he said, and I want you to teach 5th grade because there's some time in between when you need to play the organ. And I said, I don't know anything about Jewish history. He says, so you read the chapter ahead. And so that's how I really got involved. And I started teaching music and loving it, and that's where I really got involved in Jewish music.
For goodness sake. So it was really kind of, just beshared that this all evolved, sort of.
Well, everything in my life sort of happens. It just sort of happens. You've got to be in the right place at the right time, and it just sort of happens.
I must backtrack for 1 minute. What year were you born, please?
1941.
All right, so now you're becoming a teacher of music and Jewish history, and so certainly that is present in your life.
Yeah, when I left Madison, I got a teaching job in Glendale and worked at Good Hope School in Greentree, and then Riverside or Riverview or whatever it was called, the middle school. I taught music for 2 years till I got pregnant, and then they made you quit.
Really?
In those days, if you got pregnant, in fact, in January, they gave you your contracts for the next September, and they said if you even think you might be thinking about getting pregnant, don't sign this contract. But if you got pregnant and they found out about it, they let you go right away.
Oh my goodness. So this was about 1944-ish, kind of?
No.
No, this was about the mid-50s. No,
I
this
graduated.
Is early 60s.
I graduated Madison in 63, got
So
my master's in 64, so this was 64, 65 that I taught.
And those rules were still in effect?
Yes.
In the mid-60s?
Because I got pregnant with my son. He was born in July of 67, so they made me quit.
I'm going to refrain from commenting on
No,
that.
me too. I think they thought it was contagious.
It's mind-boggling.
Yes, I know.
Okay, all right, moving on. So then you had to leave.
So I had to leave teaching, and I was in a bar one night with my husband, and we were listening to this African-American gentleman, big fat guy, sitting behind a piano bar playing popular music, and I was sitting at the piano bar having a martini or two.
Uh-huh.
And my husband said, now, if you could play that kind of music, I don't know, he said, that would be nice, because I always played just classical music, and this was kind of jazz pop. So I sort of, in my drunkenness, slithered behind underneath the piano bar and sat next to him. His name was Tony King.
I was just going to say, I had a feeling it was Tony
King. And I sat next to him, and I played the melody, and he played the bottom part. And,
oh, my.
And Al said to me, well, if you learn to play like that, I'd give you jazz lessons. So the next day, I went down to the conservatory, and I said, I want to study jazz with Tony King. And I did, and I started studying jazz, and it was like I couldn't do it because my background was so classically oriented.
Uh-huh.
And so they said, Tony would say, take this piece home and come back and improvise. I said, that's like asking me to take my clothes off in public. I mean, that was really hard to do when you're not used to it.
Sure.
But anyway, as I was there at the conservatory, I met the director of the conservatory,
Who was?
Stephen J.
Okay.
And I said, I don't know what to do with my life. I need to be doing something. He said, what would you ideally like to do? I said, I'd like to teach people how to have good ears, because I always had perfect pitch, and I could look at things and write it down, or I could hear it in my head, or I could listen to a recording and write down the music, and I wanted to teach that, find a way to teach that to other people.
Now you had 2 children at this point?
Mhm.
Okay.
Oh yeah, along the way I had 2 children.
Right, okay. So you're a stay-at-home mom at this point?
Well, it was only a few months from when I left my teaching job till when I went to the conservatory.
Okay.
And so he hired me to do that, and I taught ear training and music theory and composition for.
Who devised the curriculum?
I did.
Really?
Yeah.
You had to create a whole curriculum then?
Right.
Wow.
And it was a wonderful experience because I had both jazz and classical majors in my classes at the same time. And the jazz majors could hear but couldn't write it down. The classical majors could write it down but really couldn't hear. And together they had to work together. And it was the only class that the conservatory offered where both jazz and classical majors were in the same room together. And it was a wonderful experience.
Wow. Now, where was the conservatory? It was still on Prospect Avenue?
On Prospect
It's always
Avenue,
been on
right.
Prospect.
When I was growing up, my old conservatory was on 3rd and Kilburn, but it was the conservatory, and then the college was on Prospect Avenue, but they merged in 1968.
68, okay.
So when I taught there in the 70s, it was in the Prospect building, the mansion overlooking the lake.
Let's see. How, was the class once a week, or?
Oh, no, it was 3 times a week.
3 times a week?
Right, I did that for probably 7, 8 years.
In the evenings?
No, it was during the day because it was a college. At the time, it was a degree-granting
So
institution.
your kids were in school. I'm just looking at this from the working mother's
Yeah.
standpoint, when they came along.
Yeah, kids went to nursery school. And then because my kids were growing up, then I started the first musicianship classes for kids at the conservatory and started them at 3 years old. And my kids would come in and learn how to read music. And then every once in a while when they were on vacation, I would take them to my college class and they could sight sing better than the college kids.
Oh my gosh.
College kids still remember that and they still tease me about it today. But that was a wonderful experience teaching there.
Maybe I should just back up and mention that Joyce is the past executive director of the Wisconsin Conservatory of Music until very recently, right?
President, CEO.
Right?
Mhm.
And under her leadership, the organization met and perhaps exceeded its capital goal. Among her many accomplishments, that's certainly, a wonderful, huge contribution to the community, of which, let me tell you, the entire Jewish community is proud. I know.
Thank you.
I certainly am. So that's why we're going on in this music direction for a little while. Just want to make that clear, that this was a huge part of your life.
Well, I left music for 13 years. After I left the conservatory in 1980. Then I left music for 13 years. I had just
Really?
kind of had it with music, and I just needed a break. And I think I was home maybe a week or two, and I got this phone call from this man with this beautiful resonant bass voice who said he was the executive director of Children's Service Society, and was I looking for a job? And I said, no, I wasn't, because I had just gotten off, and I wanted to take my kids to Israel for a summer, actually. And so he said, well, why don't you come and meet with me anyway? So I had to go see who this beautiful bass voice belonged to, hoping he was Jewish and he would sing in my choir at Beth Israel. But anyway, I went down to meet him, and he wasn't. But he showed me around and had this wonderful tour of Children's Service Society. He told me all about counseling for children and adoption and foster care, and it sounded just fascinating. And brought me back a second time, and I met bank presidents and people on his board. He showed me a budget, which I knew nothing about because I'd never even kept a budget or did a budget. Anyway, he left me the second interview and said, I'd like you to be my development director, and here's the salary. And I gulped, and I thought, wow, people get paid, that much money. I said, well, let me think about it. And I went home and I said to Al, what's a development director? I didn't even know what it was. So I looked it up, and I said it was fundraising. I said, oh, people get paid for that? I thought you just did that naturally with tzedakah boxes or raising money for the symphony or raising money for whatever cause you do. I thought just volunteers did that. And I didn't know whether to take the job or not.
And this was roughly which year?
My kids were 14 and 15, so it was right before we went to Israel. And so I talked to a bunch of people. I talked to the kids first, and they said, well, you're never home anywhere. You're always volunteering. You might as well get paid. So they sent me off. And then I talked to a friend of mine, George Strick, and we went out to dinner one night, and George says, take the damn job. If you don't like it, you can always quit. And so I really worked full-time for the first time in my life, and I loved it. I just loved fundraising, and I worked there for 5 years. It was just a wonderful experience. Did the world's largest tailgate party for kids at the Brewers. It was the Braves at that time, I think.
Neat.
Anyway, I worked there for 7 years, and then somebody called me and said United Cerebral Palsy was looking for an executive director with development experience because they were hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and were failing. And I said, I can't do that. I don't know anything about doing that. And somebody else said, well, take the job. You'll see
learn.
if you learn. So I
Oh,
took it, and I
sure.
loved that. It was wonderful working with people with disabilities. And we got them out of debt. And I was there for 7 years. I think the budget went from like $600,000 to over $2 million.
Oh,
And
my
It
gosh.
was just a great experience.
Oh, my goodness.
And while I was there, after 7 years, another friend of mine called and said, your conservatory, your alumna, your old school is going to close its doors in 4 months. Why don't you get over there? They need a new president and CEO. And I thought, well, what do I have to lose? I have to do something. If nothing else worked out,
And
I
music
felt-
was a big,
well, it was like coming home.
I see.
And I thought, if I don't succeed, it's okay. At least I give it a try. And so I walked into the conservatory, and the building smelled the same, except it was older and dirtier. And
So this was which year, please, that you
1993.
93, back to the conservatory.
Yes,
Okay.
so it was like coming home, but to a dilapidated stranger, I think
Sure.
is the word for it. And indeed, the budget was such that the school was going to close in 4 months. There was no money for salaries, and it was pretty bad shape. Although they still had 900 students, and they still had some of the very best teachers in the city who were there when I was teaching there, and we're still there now. So it said something about the care of that institution. So I thought if an organization had a good product, then there's got to be a way to sell the product, price the product, market the product, and deliver the product in a way that's going to make the organization stronger. And so it took 10 years, but out of those 10 years, 8 of those years we managed to operate in the black. So we pulled it out of its doldrums, and then, of course, fixed the building at the same time.
And it's so beautiful, I would
It
say.
is.
Oh, my goodness.
Were you there?
Recently. So
Yeah.
beautiful.
It is.
That, what a precious, precious landmark. And
I'm
just-
as proud of the building renovation as I am of the community service programs that we started. That, when I started there, people thought of the conservatory as being elitist, that you had to be rich or talented or from the North Shore to take lessons.
I
And
see.
it wasn't the case.
Did you establish the satellite locations?
I established 2 branch locations, one in Brookfield and one in Fox Point. But more importantly, we went out to serve children in the community, in schools. And we started with nothing, and by the time I left, we were serving 2,500 kids in
Oh,
schools
wow.
by giving them lessons and classes in music. And then I started, there had been a flute teacher who was a music therapist, and she had 4 clients that she taught. And I thought that was such a great program, especially coming from United Cerebral Palsy, that I really wanted to grow the music therapy program.
I see.
So we grew the program till we got a pool of 12 music therapists by the time I left, and we went from those 4 students to over 1,000 being
Oh.
served, or 1,100, I think, being served. And these are people with disabilities, children and adults, that get music as a way to improve their life situations.
You absolutely. Through all that, I must come back to this. Were your Jewish values a source of inspiration, a guideline? I mean, was that how did that serve you in these various capacities, if it did at all?
I can't say that I related so much, but I just made a pact with myself that my Jewishness would always be part of what I did, and I would always save time to do something. So I've been studying Hebrew for the last 30 years, and it's still active a little bit in either one Jewish organization or another, or the synagogue, or a choir, or something that would keep part of my roots there, even though I'm working 92 hours a week or whatever.
So certainly it was a presence.
It was part
through
of
all
it.
This. Yeah. And your children were raised Jewishly, as your husband told me,
Yes.
and certainly have a Jewish identity today. Your daughter being in Colorado, correct?
Mhm.
And your
Mhm.
son here.
Mhm.
It must be beyond thrilling to see the success, that the conservatory, to have it on steady ground today, and it must be very fulfilling and thrilling. putting it mildly, I'm sure.
It was a great experience. I left there in last October, and started my own business doing consulting
Consulting in?
to nonprofits.
Oh.
So all the past experiences now come together into one fold, and I can give back now to other nonprofits with what I've learned in strategic planning and management issues and hiring and startup programs, fundraising, capital campaigns, whatever.
Great. Do you have an office, or where are you?
My office is in my home, and I took on too many clients. I'm too busy, but that's life.
That's a good problem. What, in terms of Judaic, you continue to take Hebrew, and where
Yes.
are you going to go from here in your Jewish studies and so on? What, are you going to work for Jewish organizations as volunteer, or where are you in terms of?
Well, I'm on the Milwaukee Jewish Council board, and enjoy that very much. I think it's doing a great.
For community relations.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I don't know where the studying Hebrew is going to go. I just wanted to be fluent enough to be able to go to Israel and speak, and it's wonderful learning a language. It's just so very fulfilling, and it keeps you tied to your roots, and yet it gets you into situations where you can develop and grow and learn more from others.
Absolutely. And please tell me a little bit about your association with Artist Series at the Past.
Oh, that was years ago. I was one of the founding members of the board of the Artist Series of the Past.
It's a wonderful series,
Yeah.
very special.
Mhm.
Brought in great people to Milwaukee.
Absolutely.
Thrilling. So,
And somewhere along the way, I got an MBA too.
really,
Yeah.
in the midst of all this, Joyce?
Yeah, I think when I was at UCP, United Cerebral Palsy.
When did you do that?
I don't know, because by the time I got through and I saw the certificate, I said, when did I ever have time to do this? But somehow you just fit it in. It was one of those MBAs that you could do by taking courses 3 hours a night for 10 weeks and something like that. And then I don't know, it just sort of rolled in and rolled over. And
I don't. Did you ever sleep during those years?
not too often.
Let's see.
I always say if you want to get a hold of me, 3 o'clock in the morning is a good
Best
time.
time. So presently you belong to a synagogue in
Beth Israel.
Beth Israel.
Mhm.
And are you active now? Did you do choirs and so on?
I directed the adult choir and the children's choir at Beth Israel, I think, for 7 years, somewhere along the line when my kids were there and growing up. And I was just involved in the search for the new cantor for Beth Israel. But other than that, I'm not too actively involved, although I enjoy going to services when I can.
Certainly you have a strong feeling toward Israel.
Yes, I do. Wasn't afraid to go there. As I said, I took my 2 kids and lived there for a summer in whenever that was. Can't remember. And Al and I have been there 3 times, I think, and most recently, just a couple years ago. No fear at all. I was proud to be there and happy to be there.
So your husband was developing his pharmacy business?
It was pretty developed by the time I met him.
I see. Okay.
He's much older than me.
Oh,
See?
okay.
He was already established with the pharmacy when I met him.
I see. All right. But even so, you were both busy professional people, raising 2 children, going to school. This couldn't have been, always easy. I mean, women today have a lot of balancing to do with career choices and home, child rearing and, marriage. That's a hard road.
Well, I think from the beginning, Al was always very supportive. I mean, of anything I did, and always encouraged me, and I took on some very big challenges along the way, but he was always behind me saying, you can do it, or...
Wow, you're lucky.
It was,
And you for him, right? I mean...
yeah. Well, he went through a rough period medically.
Oh, I'm sorry,
He didn't talk about that?
no, so maybe we shouldn't.
No, well, that's okay. I mean, it's common knowledge. He had
Oh.
bladder cancer
Oh, I'm
and
sorry.
had to have his bladder removed, and
Oh.
we had to live in New York for a month because he went to Sloan Kettering.
Oh,
And his attitude was so positive all the way through the whole thing that he made it very easy for me to be supportive of him.
I see. Wow, these are two just amazing stories. What would you say to the Jewish community today? I mean, you've lived here your whole life, and you've seen growth and change. So what would be your wish or your vision for the continuation of the Jewish community in terms of its youth? What would be your words of wisdom to the Jewish community today as to how to flourish, as your husband said?
I think it probably all stems back to family and educating children and being involved in activities with the children. And it always it's very heartfelt when I see families going to open houses or events that the Jewish community has. I see that with my son with his little 2-year-old, and it's just a joy and a pleasure to see, and I think that's where it all starts from and where it has to continue.
And certainly an element of Jewish music in there for...
Absolutely.
All right. Is there anything else you'd like to share that we have not covered?
I'm sure there's a gazillion things I could think of.
Stop for 1 second. Give a little intro. Okay. We're just going to backtrack a little bit to hear about some of Joyce's earlier life, please.
Well, my mother always told wonderful stories about how she was the youngest of 10 children that grew up in Milwaukee. And, of course, I'm the youngest of hers, so that means I have like 37 first cousins, and they're almost all older than I am, so I never really got to know them too much.
It's a big family.
But then there was always this running battle between my mother and her sister, who claimed that she was the youngest of the 10 children, and my mother said, no, I was the youngest of the 10 children. And I guess it was resolved some way, but not until each of them passed away. And I don't even know who was the youngest anymore, but we'll think it was my mother because she liked to think that. But my aunt always had darker hair, so I don't know who was the youngest. But my father is a story in itself. If there's anybody that doesn't epitomize being a Jewish man, it's my father, because he worked in West Bend for 40 years, and even though the family lived in Milwaukee for most of that time. He was a deer hunter. He was a motorcycle rider. He owned an airport for a while. He flew. He skydived. He was a rabble rouser. He was a not your typical Jewish man, I would think, and a prankster, a jokester, and just a wonderful person in his own right.
What was his full name, please?
Albert, which is really not his name. He was born, I think, Abraham, but he had it legally changed to Albert because Abraham sounded too Jewish to him, I think. And yet, he fostered Judaism in the family. I mean, we all went to Hebrew school, it was very important that his kids grew up as a Jew, but he was not a religious person in his own right, I don't believe.
And what was your maiden name, please?
Luff, L-U-F-F. But he was a wonderful influence for me because he desperately wanted a son. And by the time his second daughter was born, he was pretty upset that he didn't have a son. And my mother had such problems, they told her not to have any more children. And they waited 7 years and decided to try again for a son. And then I guess I was born, and his term was Nacham Edel. And I was his son.
I see.
So I went bowling and hunting and fishing and flying, and I jumped out of airplanes, and I did all the things that he would want his son to do. And as a result, I had these wonderful experiences that none of my friends had. And it was a grand opportunity to become close to my father that I think I had more than my sisters did. It was an opportunity that not very many people have.
Wow.
So that was great.
Sounds like quite a guy. Now, certainly, being out in West Bend, I mean, that had to be difficult at times. There weren't too many Jews in West Bend.
No, there weren't. But growing up, because he had his place of business in West Bend, in the summers I would go with him, and I learned all the tricks of the trade.
And
like,
what was his business, please?
he had a junkyard that was mostly doing baling paper, and I learned how to bale paper and tie the wires, and I learned how to drive a forklift truck when I was 8 or 10, and drove this great big huge semi-trailer truck with the floor stick shift, and he put big blocks of wood under the pedals so I could shift and do the. I learned to pee off the bales of paper because there was no bathrooms around.
Did we get that?
Went deer hunting with him, just fishing all the time. It was wonderful experiences.
Good grief. Good grief. He sounds like quite a guy. You were lucky.
I was very lucky.
And of course it was more rural, out in West Bend at the time, right? So,
right.
Wow. And how did your mom feel about all that?
Oh, she thought it was great that I was out of her hair for the summers.
I see.
No, she was always very encouraging.
But certainly they had a strong Jewish identity, not so much in the religious sense as the secular or the cultural.
Right. Well, my mother was very active. She was part of our Hadassah and part of Horde and B'nai B'rith women, and she was always very involved in Jewish activities.
I see. So the example was set.
Right.
We are so influenced, I think, by our parents, what we see in the home. Huh?
You take a little bit of each parent, I think, with you.
And you've, of course, tried to pass that on to your children.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope that our grandchildren will.
Absolutely.
In fact, your husband saw somewhat of a problem that we're losing a lot of the young people today. Would you care to comment on that? Losing in
Intermarriage, are you talking about?
No, he didn't mention that, just in terms of maybe commitment and identity, and different from his generation, different from your generation. You may disagree. I don't know. I think that's what he was driving.
Yeah, I see it to a certain extent, but then I see the other side of it too. I see a lot of young people joining the Orthodox community.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of young people.
And BBYO is very strong.
And BBYO is strong, and I see intermarriage, yes, but I see a lot of them coming back with their spouses.
Mm-hmm. So a good balance, perhaps. A lot of positives to counterbalance.
Right, right.
Okay. I just, again, your contribution to the community is mind-boggling, and I really regard you as an example.
Thank you.
And I was so glad when I was told I was going to interview you, because as well as being a student at the conservatory, I've always admired your work. And
Well, you have also with your mimes. And
we're not going to get into this here.
Well, you
Thank
have.
you. We can talk it.
You have.
What would be, your hope for the conservatory to keep going as is, and to just maintain and, of course, enlarge upon its present programming, or things?
My hope is that all nonprofits thrive in this city. It's very difficult. They're all experiencing cuts in funding. Fundraising is ever more important, and there are only so many sources of funds. Everybody has to work a little smarter and a little harder. But for the most part, almost all nonprofits are doing such a good job in this community of serving people and in making this community a better place, Jewish, non-Jewish, whatever, that I think we all need to think about tzedakah for all the people that live in our community.
I would agree. Thank you. Thank you very much, Joyce. A pleasure. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. You're going to get me crying.